The engine sat in the middle of the auction yard, like a shipwreck no one had bothered to tow away, buried under rust and hardened oil, and a bird's nest tucked into the exhaust port, as though nature itself had declared it finished. Nobody understood why Nolan Reed, a single father who owed 3 months of rent on a shop he could barely keep warm, raised his paddle one final time and put every last dollar he had, $18,400, on that heap of corroded iron. The investors laughed when the gavel came down. But less than an hour later, Conrad Whitmore was crouching beside the machine with a cloth in his hand, and Preston Blackwell had quietly ordered his security man to chain the exit gate. Suddenly, everyone wanted to buy it back. If you believe real value hides beneath the surface where impatient eyes never look, stay with this story until the very end. The morning light came into Belhaven, Ohio, the way it always did in early autumn, sideways, pale and unconvinced of its own warmth, pressing through the single grease-filmed window of the cinder block repair shop Nolan Reed leased from a landlord who had already sent 2 written warnings about late payment. Nolan was 38 years old, lean from skipping lunches rather than from any discipline, and he moved through his shop the way a man moves through a place he is quietly terrified of losing, checking everything twice, touching the good tools the way another man might touch a photograph. He had been a single father for 4 years, since the illness that took his wife had also taken the version of his life that included 2 incomes and a backup plan, and in the space those things left behind, he had built something narrow but functional. A small mechanical repair business that kept farm equipment running for 3 rural cooperatives and a handful of private clients. The trouble was that the cooperatives paid slowly, the private clients paid even more slowly, and the loans he had taken out to replace a hydraulic press the previous spring now sat on his workbench, in the form of a notice he had read 4 times without finding better news in the fine print. 3 debts were racing toward the same due date, and Nolan had spent 2 weeks doing the arithmetic over and over on the back of parts invoices, trying to find an arrangement of numbers that would give him 6 more months of stability. It was a long-time customer named Dale Ferris, a retired machinist, who stopped by every few weeks to buy coffee and complain about modern tolerances, who mentioned the auction almost as an afterthought, setting his cup on the edge of the workbench and pulling a folded auction catalog from the pocket of his canvas jacket with the casual authority of a man who believed every piece of information was useful to someone. Hartwell Foundry had been operating at a loss for the better part of a decade, and when the last of the family ownership had finally given up trying to refinance, the bankruptcy court had authorized a full equipment liquidation, meaning every lathe, every press, every overhead crane and dusty shelf of specialty tooling was going to be sold to whoever showed up with a paddle and a checkbook. Nolan had not been planning to attend. He was not in a position to acquire equipment he did not urgently need, and he told Dale as much while thumbing through the catalog more out of politeness than genuine interest. Then he stopped on a page near the back, where a photograph so dark and poorly framed that it was nearly useless showed the partial silhouette of an industrial engine listed only as unidentified generator-type prime mover, sold as is, no documentation. The photograph was almost nothing, a shadow against a concrete floor, a suggestion of mass and mechanical complexity. But the partial view of the cylinder head showed 6 bolts arranged in a pattern that Nolan had seen only once before in his professional life, and the memory of it surfaced with the specific precision that his memory reserved for mechanical details. The bolt pattern was not commercial, not standard, not anything a production line would have specified. It was a custom arrangement, which meant someone had engineered this particular machine for a particular reason and made deliberate choices that no catalog could explain. Nolan had worked at Ashford Dynamics for 3 years in his late 20s, doing performance testing on industrial generator sets before a disagreement over a safety report had ended his employment in the blunt and permanent way such disagreements tend to end employment at large companies. He had not thought about those years often, but he had thought about them enough to retain an image that now pressed itself forward in his memory with uncomfortable insistence. A set of locked blueprint storage drawers in the engineering archive, one of which he had seen open briefly during a late-night shift when a senior engineer pulled a roll of drafting paper that showed a cylinder head layout with 6 bolts in exactly that asymmetric diagonal cluster. He had not known what it was. He had not asked. But a mechanical mind does not choose what it retains, and Nolan's had retained the bolt pattern with the same fidelity it retained everything else that did not fit neatly into familiar categories. He stood in the shop for a long time after Dale left, looking at the photograph that showed almost nothing, telling himself he was being irrational, that a man with $18,400 left in his account, the precise reserve he needed to keep the shop operational for 6 months, had no business driving 40 minutes to an auction on the basis of a partially visible bolt pattern in a bad photograph. He told himself this twice more while he was locking up the shop. He told himself once more while he was driving. The auction was held in the main floor of Hartwell Foundry itself, a vaulted industrial space where the smell of decades of metalwork had saturated the concrete walls so deeply that no amount of vacancy could remove it. And the early morning crowd that filled the folding chairs and standing room was a cross-section of the kind of money that circles bankruptcy proceedings the way certain birds circle a field after a harvest. Preston Blackwell arrived with 2 assistants and a personal attorney, all of them wearing coats that cost more than Nolan's monthly shop rent, and they moved through the space with the ease of people who had attended so many of these events that the atmosphere of financial distress had become, for them, merely a backdrop to comfortable acquisition. Conrad Whitmore came alone, but was recognized by the auctioneer, who greeted him by name with a deference that suggested his presence elevated the proceedings, and Whitmore moved slowly among the equipment displays with the unhurried attention of a man who was shopping, not bidding on necessity. There were representatives from 3 regional manufacturing firms, 2 scrapyard operators who had come primarily to estimate metal weights, and then there was Nolan Reed in a work jacket that still carried the grease from a tractor transmission he had finished the night before, standing slightly apart from the rest of the crowd with a paper catalog he had already folded to the last page. He spent the first 40 minutes of the event ignoring everything except the engine at the far end of the floor, where it sat on a wooden pallet with the sullen indifference of something that had long since stopped caring what anyone thought of it. Up close, the machine was larger than the photograph had suggested. Nearly 10 feet in length, the block cast from some alloy that caught light differently than standard gray iron, the surface patched with rust and carbonized oil deposits, and a section of outer casing that appeared to have been exposed to significant heat at some point. There was no manufacturer's nameplate anywhere on the body, and the spaces where identification tags might have been mounted showed the scarring of intentional removal. Not corrosion, but deliberate tool marks, which was a different thing entirely. The throttle linkage was broken, the crankshaft had seized. Several ancillary components had been removed, leaving mounting brackets occupied only by air. The auctioneer, when he reached this item late in the morning, described it without enthusiasm as an unidentified power unit of uncertain vintage, noted that no service records or provenance documents were available, recommended it as a source of raw material or as a display piece for parties with industrial aesthetic preferences, and opened bidding at $500 as though apologizing for wasting everyone's time. Nolan had already found what he was looking for before the bidding opened crouching beside the engine on the pretext of examining the pallet condition, while actually pressing his thumbnail into a deposit of hardened grease on the lower block face and scraping at it with the focused patience of someone who knows exactly what he is looking for and is willing to wait until it appears. Beneath 3 layers of accumulated contamination, cast directly into the metal as a foundry mark rather than a stamped edition, were 3 diagonal parallel lines arranged in a specific angular relationship that Nolan had seen exactly twice in his life. Once on a reference document in Ashford Dynamics' engineering archive, and once on a small identification plate shown to him briefly by a colleague who had since left the industry. The mark was not a commercial foundry symbol. It was an internal identification used by Ashford's research division for prototype work that was not part of the standard production catalog. Nolan stood up slowly, brushed his hands on his jacket, and raised his paddle for the first time when bidding reached $800. The early competition came from a scrap dealer named Marcus, who had estimated the engine's metal content at around $1,200 in raw salvage value and was prepared to go to $1,500. Nolan matched him without showing any reaction, a habit he had acquired working at a company where the wrong expression at the wrong moment could be interpreted as insubordination. The bidding climbed through 2,000, 5,000, and it was around 6,000 that Nolan noticed Conrad Whitmore had stopped moving through the space and was standing very still at the edge of the gathering crowd, his catalog lowered, his attention fixed on the engine with the careful suppression of excitement rather than excitement itself, which is a more telling thing. Preston Blackwell noticed Whitmore's posture at approximately the same moment and leaned toward one of his assistants with a quiet instruction that caused the assistant to step away and begin composing something on a mobile phone. The bidding passed 10,000, and the crowd's mood shifted from amusement to the watchful tension that attends any situation where the players are not all showing their hands. Nolan's hands were not showing anything, but the arithmetic inside was moving quickly, and not in a comfortable direction. The number in his bank account was not a comfortable reserve. It was the minimum required to prevent a cascade of failures that would begin with the landlord and end with him operating out of a rented bay at someone else's facility. He understood this the way a man who has been near the edge of financial catastrophe understands arithmetic, not abstractly, but viscerally, with a sensation in the chest that is somewhere between calculation and fear. But he also understood that whatever was inside this machine was something multiple people in the room recognized as significant, and that if he walked away now, he would spend the rest of his life knowing he had stood where the answer was available, and chosen not to find out. He raised his paddle a final time at $18,400. The room went quiet, then laughed. The scattered reflexive laughter of people who have decided that a man in a work jacket bidding his apparent last dollar on a machine no one could start must be either desperate or deluded. The gavel came down. The engine belonged to Nolan Reed. The weight of what he had done settled on Nolan within 4 minutes of the gavel's descent. Approximately how long it took for the clerk to process his payment, and for him to walk back to the engine with the bill of sale in his hand and no immediate plan for getting a 10-foot engine block weighing somewhere north of 4,000 pounds out of the building and across 40 miles of state highway. He was working through the problem of finding a flatbed when Conrad Whitmore appeared at his elbow with the unhurried courtesy of a man who has cultivated the ability to approach people in a manner that feels like coincidence. Whitmore was 64 years old and looked like a man who had spent that time accumulating knowledge that cannot be purchased, but can only be gathered by paying close attention to a great many things over a long period, and he carried this with the particular confidence of collectors. Not the confidence of certainty, but of being consistently right about objects when everyone else was guessing. He produced a cloth from his breast pocket and applied it to a section of the lower casing near the oil drain, working with the careful pressure of someone who knows that haste damages surfaces that patience preserves. What appeared beneath the grime was a sequence of alphanumeric characters stamped into the metal, a 0x17. Whitmore straightened, folded the cloth with deliberate neatness, and made Nolan an offer of $30,000 in the tone of a man who considers the offer reasonable, because he is choosing not to mention what he knows about the item's actual significance. Nolan said no, not aggressively, not at length, just no, and a statement that he needed to examine the machine before making any decisions about it. The rejection moved through the room's social atmosphere quickly, in the way that one person's refusal to accept an obviously profitable offer always moves through rooms where profit is the primary language. It signaled that the item was worth more than the offer, and this signal reached Preston Blackwell before Whitmore had finished refolding his cloth. Preston's offer came through an intermediary, $50,000. With the condition that Nolan execute a transfer of title before leaving the building, a condition whose urgency told Nolan more about the situation than the amount did. Then the number became $75,000 from an energy sector representative who had been standing near the back of the crowd and who suddenly found a reason to introduce himself, and the number became $100,000 from a source Nolan did not immediately identify. And with each escalation, the circle of people around the machine tightened until Nolan understood that he was standing at the center of something that had been waiting in this building for a very long time, wrapped in rust and motor oil and the deliberate absence of identifying information. Preston Blackwell had his security personnel close the exterior doors on the basis of an incomplete asset inventory, a transparent legal maneuver that Nolan addressed by standing in front of his signed bill of sale and stating clearly that the transaction had been completed and the asset had new ownership, and that the new owner would be leaving shortly. The standoff lasted 20 minutes. It ended not with confrontation, but with Nolan borrowing a forklift from a foundry worker he had repaired equipment for 2 years earlier and driving the engine out of the building on a borrowed transport frame while Preston's attorney composed documents that had no immediate legal effect. As Nolan turned onto the state highway heading back toward Belhaven, his phone rang. The caller identification read, Ashford Dynamics, Executive Office. He brought the engine into the shop after midnight, backing the transport through the double doors with the care of a man who understood that the apparent condition of an object and its actual condition are frequently unrelated things. He ran the chain through the door handles and killed the outside lights and stood in front of the machine with only a work lamp before he touched anything, beginning at the beginning the way a diagnostician begins, not looking for what he expected to find, but letting the machine describe itself. The alloy of the block was lighter than cast iron by a margin not commercially available in the period when the machine appeared to have been manufactured, which told him the project had material resources above standard production. The combustion chamber geometry was asymmetric in a way that served a specific thermodynamic function, and the fuel delivery system did not match any injection architecture Nolan could place within the relevant era. The crankshaft balance was precise to a tolerance that existed in the industry but would not routinely be applied to generator work, because the cost of that precision was not justified by the application unless the application was something other than routine industrial power generation. None of the damage was accidental. Nolan understood this after 2 hours of examination with the thoroughness of certainty rather than the tentativeness of suspicion. The blocked oil passage had been sealed with a machined steel plug installed by someone who knew where the oil passage was and what blocking it would do to the engine under load. The governor gear had been reversed by someone who understood governor systems. The identification markings had been removed with tools, not with time. What had been done to this machine had been done carefully and specifically by someone who wanted it to fail in a way that would not immediately appear to be sabotage. At the bottom of the lower sump, sealed inside a copper tube that had been threaded into a drain port with a washer and lock nut, Nolan found 3 pages of technical documentation written in a precise, small hand on paper that smelled of the decades it had spent in metal and oil. The name at the top of the first page was Dr. Elias Caldwell. The pages described a multi-fuel prime mover capable of achieving combustion efficiency substantially beyond comparable power output machines of its era, and the description used precise engineering language with the authority of someone describing work they had personally done and understood completely. But the pages Nolan had were not all the pages. Sections referenced calculations that did not appear in the remaining documents, and the governor's specification was referenced but not detailed, which meant the documentation was incomplete. He photographed every page. Then he sat on his workbench and answered the call from Evelyn Ashford, who asked to purchase the machine for $250,000 and described it as a displaced piece of family engineering heritage. Nolan asked why a piece of family heritage had been stripped of its identification, deliberately disabled, and sold as unidentified scrap. The call ended without a satisfactory answer. The next morning, the rental sign had been removed from the front of his building by a real estate company, acting on behalf of a buyer whose name was not yet on any document. Preston Blackwell worked through legitimate channels with the methodical efficiency of a man who has learned that the most durable kind of pressure is the kind that wears a legal hat. He acquired Nolan's outstanding equipment loan from the regional bank that had issued it, converting himself from a bidder into a creditor, which was a different and more powerful position. He approached Nolan's landlord with a purchase offer for the building site that was generous enough to make the landlord's existing tenant arrangement feel like an inconvenience rather than an asset. And he filed a complaint with the county environmental office, suggesting that an unidentified industrial engine of uncertain history might contain regulated materials, which generated an inspection notice that Nolan received on a Tuesday with a Wednesday response deadline. Nolan read all 3 pieces of correspondence with the focused calm of a man who has already accepted that things are going badly and is now engaged in the more productive question of what to do about it. He was calculating how many days he had before the cumulative pressure became structural when Conrad Whitmore called. And this call was different from the first encounter because Whitmore was offering information rather than money. According to Whitmore's research records, he kept meticulous records, cross-referenced by year and individual. In the way of serious collectors, a mechanical engineer named Elias Caldwell had been contracted to Ashford Dynamics in 1961 and 62, working directly with Wallace Ashford on a research project designated internally as the Zero Fuel Index Program, which aimed to reduce the per-kilowatt fuel consumption of industrial generator sets by applying combustion geometry insights that Caldwell had developed independently. In 1963, Caldwell submitted what his own correspondents called a working proof of concept and was preparing for a formal performance demonstration when the project was abruptly closed. All documentation was reclassified or destroyed, and Caldwell left the industry under circumstances that had left him convinced that his life's best work had been deliberately buried. The prototype, which Caldwell believed had been destroyed along with the documentation, appeared instead to have been disabled and placed in storage at a facility that subsequently changed hands multiple times before ending its life as Hartwell Foundry. Whitmore had a theory about why it had been stored rather than destroyed. Wallace Ashford had not been able to bring himself to erase it completely, because doing so would have meant acknowledging, in some private way, that what he had done to Caldwell was not merely a business decision. Miriam Caldwell lived in a town called Reeseville, 40 miles from Belhoven, in a house that had belonged to her parents, and that she had stayed in after her father's death, because leaving would have felt like a second abandonment of the same man. She was 70 years old, and had spent a significant portion of those years in the specific pain of watching a parent be publicly categorized as a failure in the field to which he had given his best capabilities, and this pain had settled into something no longer raw but permanent. A fact about the world she had learned to carry without being crushed by, but had never stopped knowing was there. When Nolan arrived at her door and asked whether she was Elias Caldwell's daughter, she told him she was not interested in answering questions about her father, and was closing the door when Nolan held up the 3 pages of technical documentation, not demanding anything, not arguing, just holding up the paper so she could see her father's handwriting at the top of the first page. And Miriam stood very still in her doorway for a long moment before she opened it wider and let him in. She corroborated everything Whitmore had told Nolan, and added what Whitmore had not known: that Wallace Ashford had made Elias a verbal promise of shared patent ownership, that the company had subsequently claimed the design carried safety deficiencies that Elias had disputed strenuously, and that Elias had spent the last years of his life believing the deficiencies had been fabricated to justify excluding him from the commercial rights. She went to a shelf without being asked and returned with a composition notebook, its cover worn to near transparency from years of handling, which she placed in Nolan's hands with the careful deliberation of someone making an irreversible decision. Inside was Elias Caldwell's governor specification, the section absent from the pages in the copper tube, hand-drafted with the precision of a man who had been trained to express himself in engineering notation and trusted it more than any other language. Miriam said she did not want money. She wanted her father's name associated with the work he had actually done, placed on the correct side of a historical record that had been falsified before she was old enough to know it was happening. Nolan drove back to Belhaven with the notebook on the passenger seat and the knowledge that he could likely restore the engine to operating condition, and with one problem remaining. The governor gear that had been reversed was not a reversible reversal. The original gear had been replaced with a mirror image casting, which meant he needed a specific period component that had not been manufactured in 30 years, and which existed, if it existed at all, somewhere in the stock that Ashford Dynamics kept in a parts preservation archive that was not accessible to the public. Evelyn Ashford arrived at the shop on a Thursday morning, without an assistant, without a legal representative, and without the cultivated remoteness that had characterized her telephone manner. And Nolan, who was lying under a tractor when she knocked, spent a moment adjusting to the fact that she looked genuinely tired in a way that expensive clothing cannot entirely conceal. She was 41 years old and had run a multi-billion-dollar manufacturing company for 6 years as the third-generation descendant of its founder, and the combination of inherited expectation and earned competence had produced in her a composure that was very nearly impenetrable, except, as Nolan was discovering, in circumstances where she could no longer pretend that the thing being discussed was primarily a business problem. Preston Blackwell had purchased enough outstanding shares through intermediaries to force a board vote on executive leadership, and the vote was scheduled for 4 days from now, and the decisive variable was whether the Caldwell documentation, once made public, would damage the company sufficiently to make Preston's restructuring narrative persuasive. If the board understood the engine as damaging evidence, before it understood it as resolvable history, Ashford Dynamics would be weakened at exactly the moment a buyer was positioned to acquire it cheaply. Evelyn was not here to buy the engine. She had spent 48 hours reading everything her company's archive contained about Elias Caldwell, and had arrived at the conclusion that her grandfather had made a decision whose consequences had not finished arriving yet. She made him an offer, $500,000 in cash, the payoff of all his outstanding debts, and a new shop in a building the company owned outright, in exchange for the engine, the documentation, and an agreement not to make the Caldwell history public. Nolan listened to the offer completely, which she had not fully expected, and then told her that the offer required him to put a price on the suppression of a man's legitimate claim to his own work, and that he was not willing to do that, regardless of what the number was. Evelyn said that Nolan was gambling his daughter's future on the reputation of someone who had been dead for 14 years. Nolan said that he was a father, and that because he was a father, he could not teach his daughter that the people who own things have the authority to erase the people who made them, because that was a lesson about the world that would cost his daughter something she would not be able to name or replace. The conversation was quiet. There was no raised voice on either side. But Evelyn looked at the engine while Nolan was talking, and she looked at the precise tool marks around the removed identification plates, and she looked at the way the blocked oil passage had been sealed. Not carelessly, not under time pressure, but carefully, by someone who knew what they were doing, and something in her face shifted in the way faces shift when a person decides that the story they have been telling themselves about something is not precisely the story that happened. She did not ask for the engine again. Instead, she told him about the Parts Preservation Archive, a climate-controlled storage facility at the Ashford Dynamics main plant, where decommissioned prototype components were kept partly for engineering reference, and partly, Nolan suspected, because some previous generation of leadership had understood that disposing of things entirely creates a different category of risk than storing them quietly. The governor casting he needed was logged in the archive under a research project designation that had been dormant for 3 decades. She could authorize access before the board vote changed her access privileges. Nolan said he understood what she was offering and what it cost her to offer it. She left without the engine. He drove to the Ashford Dynamics plant the following morning and found the component in the 4th storage bay, still in its original wax paper packaging, sitting between 2 crates of components from projects that no longer existed and would never be completed. 4 days was not much time, but it was time that could be used efficiently by a man who slept only when his body refused to continue, and who knew the machine well enough to work in a specific sequence without doubling back. Nolan cleaned the oil passages, replaced the main and rod bearings with modern equivalents machined to original specifications, reground the injector nozzles to a profile derived from the documentation and Elias Caldwell's notebook, and trued the crankshaft on the alignment fixture with the patience that exhaustion kept trying to interrupt and attention kept refusing to allow. Evelyn returned each of the 3 remaining days, not to supervise but to understand. She stood where she could see without being in the way, and asked technically specific questions that suggested she had studied the documentation between visits. Conrad Whitmore arrived uninvited on the 2nd evening, and was permitted to stay because his knowledge filled gaps that neither Nolan nor Evelyn could fill alone, and Miriam Caldwell came once, on the 2nd afternoon, standing beside the open engine, with her hand resting on the block in the specific stillness of someone engaged in a private act of recognition. The fracture in the cylinder head appeared at 3 in the morning on the 3rd day, when Nolan was applying pressure testing fluid and watching for the vapor trail that would indicate a sealed chamber, and instead found a trace, not a gross defect, not a failure anyone would describe as obvious, but a crack propagating from a stress riser near the combustion chamber boundary in a geometry that would have allowed the engine to start and run briefly before the pressure differential caused catastrophic head separation under load. This was where prototype testing without sabotage might have caught the problem and fixed it. Instead, the sabotage had ensured the engine never ran, which meant the fracture had never been discovered, which meant it had sat for 3 decades inside a machine that the world believed was simply an early-stage prototype that hadn't worked. Nolan used a cold weld compound of a type he had used on 2 previous industrial repairs and had researched extensively after the first time, reinforced with a machined steel retention ring fitted into a groove he cut with a carbide bit at a radius calculated to distribute the hoop stress away from the fracture line. It was not elegant work. It was the work of a man in a concrete block shop at 3 in the morning with the tools he had and the knowledge he had accumulated over 20 years of making broken things work again. And it would hold, because Nolan's repairs held, because he did not move on until they did. Lila came to the shop on the afternoon of the 3rd day, carrying a foil-wrapped plate that contained the 2 best portions of a meal she had made from ingredients Nolan had left her. She was 11 and cooked, with the improvisational confidence of someone who has been managing a household's meals for longer than was strictly appropriate for her age. And she sat on the tool cabinet and watched her father for a while without speaking. She asked, eventually, whether he was going to lose everything. Nolan stopped what he was doing and looked at her, and he said, "Not everything, no." He said he was going to finish what he had started, and that what happened afterward would happen afterward, but he was going to finish it. Lila accepted this answer with the pragmatic equanimity that she had developed as an adaptive response to having a parent whose certainties were never larger than the evidence warranted, and she left when the plate was empty, and kissed him on the side of the head in passing, with the absent tenderness of someone for whom this gesture has become part of the grammar of ordinary life. Preston's final offer arrived by courier at 11 that evening. $2 million, delivered within 24 hours of receiving a signed transfer instrument. $2 million was a number that Nolan sat with for an honest duration, because refusing $2 million requires sitting with the full weight of what that number would mean. Not the abstractions of wealth, but the specifics. The shop paid off, the debt cleared, Lila's future secured, the particular daily anxiety of financial precariousness ended. He sat with all of that. Then he thought about Preston Blackwell standing in front of this machine with a plan that did not include the engine running again, or Elias Caldwell's name being spoken aloud. He wrote a 1-sentence refusal on the back of the courier envelope and sent it back with the same courier. He pulled the start handle at 2:47 in the morning, and the engine turned over 4 times and stopped with a metallic knock from the number 3 cylinder that suggested an interference problem he had not yet identified. Nolan did not sleep. He went back to the number 3 cylinder with a cold light inspection lamp and found what he had missed in the accumulated exhaustion of 3 working days. A counterweight on the crankshaft that was positioned at an angle that could not have been the result of manufacturing error, because the crankshaft was otherwise precisely balanced, and precise balancing does not coexist with a mispositioned counterweight unless the counterweight was moved after the balance was achieved. Someone had repositioned the counterweight after the crankshaft had been finished, an act that required specific knowledge of what the counterweight's displacement would cause, specifically the damaging resonance frequency it would create during the startup transient, which would cause the engine to appear to fail its initial performance test without leaving obvious evidence of interference. This was not the work of someone who wanted to slow down a project. This was the work of someone who wanted to ensure that a particular prototype, on a particular test date, failed in a particular way that would be recorded as a design deficiency in the official documentation and used to justify closing the project and denying the designer his co-ownership claim. Nolan took a photograph of the counterweight in its installed position before he touched it. Then he removed the counterweight assembly, repositioned it to the location specified in Elias Caldwell's original documentation, and torqued it to specification. On the underside of the counterweight, cast into the metal in letters small enough to have been overlooked by anyone not specifically looking for them, were two names, E. Caldwell and W. Ashford, not subordinate and principal, not inventor and employer. Two names of equal size in the same foundry font, in a location that would only be seen by someone who disassembled the machine to this level of detail. Nolan called Evelyn at 5 in the morning and read her the two names without preamble. There was a silence on her end that lasted long enough to be something other than processing. It was the silence of someone receiving information that changes the shape of the story they have been living inside. She said she would arrange the independent demonstration for the following morning. Nolan said he understood what that arrangement would cost her and what it would require her to acknowledge publicly about her company's history. She said the cost and the requirement were the same thing, and that she had spent enough years managing what her grandfather had protected to have an informed opinion about whether it was worth the effort. Nolan pulled the start handle at 6:43 in the morning, with Evelyn Ashford and Miriam Caldwell standing on either side of the engine and Conrad Whitmore behind him, and the machine turned over once, twice, a third time, and then it caught, and the sound that filled the shop was not the aggressive mechanical clatter of a struggling machine, but a low, even, deliberate frequency, a rhythm that suggested something not trying to prove anything, simply doing what it was built to do, as though it had been waiting 30 years for someone to correct the one thing that was not its fault. The formal demonstration took place at the Ashford Dynamics testing facility, before an audience that included 3 independent mechanical engineers, the full board of directors, and 2 journalists from the regional industrial press, who had been invited because Evelyn understood that public testimony is more durable than private documentation. Preston Blackwell arrived with a legal team and a prepared injunction application based on an intellectual property dispute theory, and Evelyn countered it with a chain of ownership argument that placed legal title clearly with Nolan Reed as the purchaser at a properly conducted public auction, and placed documentation rights clearly with Miriam Caldwell as her father's sole surviving heir. The judge who heard the emergency application found no basis for halting a demonstration of equipment legally owned by the person demonstrating it. The engine ran for 4 hours under observation, and the independent engineers confirmed what Elias Caldwell's notes had claimed in 1963. The combustion efficiency figures substantially exceeded comparable machines of the period, and the design principles that produced those figures were not present in any subsequent commercial engine line, meaning they had been buried with the prototype rather than studied and developed. The investors who had laughed at Nolan 4 days earlier now stood around him in a cluster, each offering more money than the last, the numbers rising with the eagerness of people who understand they have misread a situation and are now trying to correct for it with velocity. The offers came in rapid succession. Conrad Whitmore proposed $3 million for permanent museum acquisition, citing the engine's unique status as the sole surviving evidence of a significant suppressed development in industrial power engineering. A representative from an energy infrastructure company offered $5 million for exclusive research rights. Preston Blackwell, operating now through a third-party holding company, whose connection to his fund required 3 layers of corporate registration to trace, offered $7 million through an intermediary who presented the offer as a straightforward commercial transaction without mentioning Preston's name. Ashford Dynamics, through Evelyn, proposed a combination of cash and equity that Nolan's approximate calculation placed somewhere between $4 and $6 million, depending on company performance over the following 5 years. Nolan listened to all of them. He understood, in the way that a man understands something he has been moving toward without knowing it until he arrives, that he was standing in the center of a second auction. But this time he was the one holding the object, and the object was real, and everyone in the room knew it was real. And the question was not whether to sell but what selling meant, and what it cost and who paid the cost. He told them he needed a day. The conditions Nolan Reed presented the following morning were not the conditions of a man negotiating for maximum financial return, and the people in the room took a moment to process this before they began responding, because the gap between what they had expected and what they received was wide enough to require adjustment. He stated 3 things. Elias Caldwell was to be officially recognized as co-creator of the engine and co-originator of the design principles it embodied, in every document, announcement, publication, and marketing material produced by any party using the technology derived from it. All development work based on the prototype's design was subject to independent safety verification before any commercial application. Because a design that had been suppressed in part through a fabricated safety finding deserved the protection of a process whose integrity was not controlled by the parties with a financial stake in its outcome. And a defined percentage of any commercial revenue derived from the technology was to fund training programs for mechanical workers in industrial towns that had experienced the kind of economic contraction that Belhaven had been experiencing for 20 years. Evelyn accepted without extended negotiation, because she had spent a day with the full archive of what her family had done to Elias Caldwell, and had arrived at a point where acceptance was not a concession but a correction. Preston rejected the conditions, announced that he was making the documentation public to demonstrate that Ashford Dynamics had appropriated private intellectual property, and produced a set of internal company communications from the 1960s that he had obtained through his board access. The communications confirmed, in the handwriting of Wallace Ashford's personal secretary, that the safety deficiency finding had been manufactured. The board of directors, viewing this documentation in the context of Preston Blackwell having concealed it during months of acquisition negotiations in order to use it as a private lever, responded to it by removing Preston's designated board representative and voting to retain Evelyn Ashford as CEO on the condition that she pursue a transparent resolution of the Caldwell matter, which was the resolution Nolan's conditions had already outlined. Nolan signed a licensing agreement rather than a sale, which meant the engine remained in his possession. Miriam Caldwell sat in the back of the boardroom during the signing and watched her father's name appear on a corporate document for the first time as a recognized creator rather than an absent variable, and she did not say anything while this was happening. But the expression on her face was the expression of someone who has been carrying a weight so long they had stopped noticing its specific mass until the moment it was lifted. Conrad Whitmore was granted display rights for a defined period following the completion of research, which satisfied both his purposes, the historical and the aesthetic, and which he accepted with the gracious equanimity of a man who has learned that not getting everything immediately is frequently a precondition for eventually getting the things that matter. Nolan left the building with a bank transfer that was not generational wealth, but was enough to clear his debts, retain his tools, and build forward from a position that did not require him to perform a daily calculation of how many more days he had before something structural gave way. A year later, the sign above the shop read Caldwell Reed Works, not a name chosen for marketing purposes, but because Nolan thought both names should be on the building, since both had contributed to what went on inside it. The business was larger now, a proper bay with 3 lifts, 2 apprentices in their early 20s learning mechanical work the way Nolan had learned it, by doing it alongside someone who knew how and who did not make the knowing feel like a gift. Evelyn Ashford came to the shop regularly, initially as the licensing arrangement's primary contact, and then in a capacity that required no professional description, and that both of them treated with the careful respect of adults who understand that the things worth having are also the things worth being patient about. The engine line that Ashford Dynamics developed from the Caldwell Prototypes principles, refined, modernized, independently verified, went into limited production the following spring, and its efficiency figures appeared in 2 engineering school curricula and 1 industrial policy paper, and none of those documents omitted Elias Caldwell's name. Miriam attended the public acknowledgement ceremony in a hall at the Ashford Dynamics facility, where a portrait of Elias Caldwell was placed beside a portrait of Wallace Ashford with a caption that described them as co-originators of a design methodology, which was more accurate than what had been recorded before, and was, therefore, better. She stood in front of her father's portrait for a private moment before the public portion of the event began, and Nolan stood nearby at a distance that felt respectful rather than absent, and nobody asked her to speak, and she did not speak, but she stayed for the entire event and ate the food and accepted the handshakes of people who had known her father's name only as a missing citation in a technical history, and who now had the chance to know it as something more correctly placed. The engine itself stood in the center of the main demonstration floor, displayed on a low steel platform under a focused light, and it had not been fully restored to an appearance of newness. The outer casing still wore most of its rust and the marks of its decades of concealment and the scars of what had been done to it, because Nolan and Evelyn had agreed, without extensive discussion, that cleaning those marks away would be a different kind of falsification. The interior mechanical systems were clean and correctly assembled and verified to specification, and the engine ran, and that was the fact that mattered. The placard beside it did not attribute the machine to a corporation or a research program. It said, "Designed by 2 engineers who worked together, hidden by the institutions that should have protected their collaboration, and returned to the historical record by a mechanic who paid attention to a detail that everyone with more money and more confidence had already decided was not worth noticing." Nolan stood in front of it on the morning of the ceremony before the building had filled with people, in the particular quiet of an empty room that is about to become crowded, and he remembered the auction yard and the way the laughter had moved through the bidding crowd when the gavel came down, the specific tone of it, the quality of certainty it contained. The certainty of people who knew the difference between value and the appearance of value, and who were very confident they were on the right side of that distinction. He remembered what he had seen in the auction hall that the others had not seen, and he knew that what he had seen was not certainty, it was a question, a detail that did not align with the story the object appeared to be telling about itself. He had paid everything he had for the right to ask the question, and the question had been worth asking. The engine sat before him now, still carrying its rust on the outside, still unmistakably the same object that had sat in the auction yard and been evaluated and dismissed, its surface unchanged, its worth now beyond reasonable dispute. Proof, if any were needed, that rust does not reduce what a thing is made of, it only prevents the impatient from seeing it.
Temple.
Was you watching when he was playing Avatar?
Once it was bustling with worshippers. before it was
Using,
ruined by
I
that
think everyone's
fire.
watched you during different games. What's up, Ryan? How you doing? Love you too, bro. How you doing today, man? I like this game, Ryan. It's been a while since I played
The
it, but
temple was
it's been on my mind a
flooded.
lot. I actually downloaded it a day or two ago and just never played it.
What good
But
is
I've
it
been thinking
to
about it because I
rebuild
wanted
the
like
temple
back-to-back boss battles, bro. It
if
feels
the
good when you
goodwill of
beat it. It
men
feels good.
has been burnt to ashes?
Isn't it your top 3? Oh yeah, I love this game. I played it a couple times, but I haven't beat it. Okay,
You've
hopefully I get to
forgotten
beat
this
it this
place,
time.
but they haven't forgotten
This game right
you.
now, I think they still sell it for about $60, bro.
That's a tough
If
one.
you're on PC, I'm sure you could
Good
use like
luck to
Loaded or
you.
something, get it for a few bucks less. I don't know if it's on Game Pass or anything like that. Yeah. Okay, thank you so much for that follow. I really appreciate you. No, I haven't fought Erlang. Who's this? Oh.